They said it was over. The calf hadn't moved in hours. His tiny body lay still on the blood-stained earth, slick with birth fluids and dust, limbs curled in a lifeless pose. Around him, the herd shifted uneasily, trumpeting low rumbles of confusion and mourning. The sun had long since risen, casting long shadows over the acacia trees. And still, he didn't stir. But his mother refused to move. She stood over him, massive and trembling, her ears fanned wide, her breath heavy and uneven. Her name was Semba. She was 27 years old and had carried this calf through a brutal dry season, long migrations, and 2 territorial battles. She had felt every kick, every twitch inside her belly. She had chosen this patch of land, a quiet slope near the edge of the reserve, to bring him into the world. But something had gone wrong. The labor had been long, too long. The calf had come out quiet, too quiet, his trunk limp, his chest unmoving. The rangers had whispered to one another in clipped Swahili, their eyes darting between their radios and her still body. One had stepped forward cautiously, only to be driven back by a trumpet so loud it made birds flee from the trees. Semba wouldn't let anyone near, not the rangers, not even the matriarch. She touched his body with her trunk again and again, nudging, lifting, stroking, not out of confusion, but conviction. She didn't trumpet in grief. She didn't scream in denial. She simply stood there, waiting. 27 hours passed. Through the heat of the midday sun and the cooling dusk, she remained motionless. Vultures circled above, drawn by the scent of afterbirth and stillness. The other elephants had moved on, grazing in the distance, casting occasional glances back with heavy eyes. But she didn't flinch. She barely blinked. She just breathed, heavy, slow, deliberate. And somewhere in that stillness, something shifted. Not in the wind, not in the grass, but under her, a twitch, almost imperceptible, a ripple in the dust, a flutter of the calf's trunk like a whisper against the earth. And for the first time in 27 hours, Semba moved, not to mourn, but to answer. At first, no one believed it. The movement was too small, too soft, the kind of shift that could have been wind or wishful thinking. But Semba knew. Her trunk froze midair, suspended between despair and hope. She leaned in slowly, lowering her massive head until it nearly touched the ground, her breath brushing against her calf's side like a prayer no one could hear. Then he did it again. A twitch of his back leg, a flutter of his ear, a soft gasp, a whisper of breath so shallow it barely disturbed the dust beneath his mouth. And Semba began to rumble. Not the warning call of a threatened matriarch, not the shriek of pain or rage, but a low trembling hum from deep in her chest, a sound older than words, older than memory. It was the song of life calling life back from the edge, a lullaby only elephants knew how to sing. The rangers stepped closer now, cautiously, their disbelief visible in every hesitant step. One raised a pair of binoculars, another held a walkie-talkie with trembling hands but didn't speak. There were no words for what they were seeing. Semba crouched, an impossible act for an elephant her size, and used her trunk to gently lift the calf's head. He was breathing now, shallow, irregular, but alive. His eyes fluttered beneath their folds, searching for light, for warmth, for the shape of the being who had never once left him. He found her, and Semba's rumble deepened. It resonated across the dry basin, like the echo of a heartbeat through time. The matriarch and the others returned in slow waves, forming a protective half-circle around mother and son. None of them approached. None of them dared interrupt the rhythm being rebuilt from silence. Semba began touching him again, but it wasn't desperate anymore. It was deliberate. Her trunk stroked his spine, pressed gently to his chest, tapped the tip of his trunk. Every touch a message, I am here, I stayed, come back. And the calf responded, not with strength, he was far too weak, but with trust. He didn't try to stand, didn't try to cry. He simply turned his head into her body and let out the smallest breath of air, a sigh, as if to say, okay. By the second nightfall, the rangers had named him Tembo, the Swahili word for elephant. Though Semba would never need a name to recognize him, they brought in water, stayed at a distance, watched from behind trees. A veterinarian whispered something about oxygen deprivation and odds, but no one dared speak too loud, because something sacred was unfolding in front of them. No interventions, no miracles, just the unspoken power of presence. A mother's refusal to let go, a child's decision to return. Together they had written a kind of quiet defiance against biology and expectation. Tembo began to lift his head on his own, then his front legs. Then in the early dawn of the third day, while the sky was still soft with stars and the grass held on to the last of the night's dew, he stood. Wobbly, crooked, fragile. But he stood, and Semba, who had not closed her eyes in nearly 70 hours, finally did. Not in surrender, but in release. As if the weight of waiting had finally been lifted. As if the question she had carried, whether to hope or to grieve, had been answered. And the answer was breathing beside her. Not in a roar or a trumpet, but in the soft, rhythmic inhale of a calf who had been silent for too long. Tembo leaned into his mother, his legs trembling beneath him, but he stood his ground with a quiet resilience that only those who've touched the edge of absence understand. Semba didn't nudge him. She didn't guide him. She simply remained still, shoulder to shoulder, flank to flank, as if offering him not direction, but companionship. Around them, the herd watched with reverent silence. No one trumpeted, no one moved. The sun rose slowly, catching in the fine hairs along Tembo's back, turning his fragile frame into a silhouette of defiance against a world that had already counted him out. A ranger lowered his camera. Another wiped his face, unsure whether it was sweat or tears. There were no speeches, no interventions, just the heavy stillness of a morning that meant something. And in that stillness, Tembo took a step. One small, trembling, imperfect step, then another. His movements were uncoordinated, his footing uncertain, but he moved not because anyone told him to, but because she was there, still, unyielding. A monument of love carved from flesh and time. And when he stumbled, Semba didn't panic. She didn't flinch. She simply curled her trunk around his midsection, not lifting, not pushing, just holding, and waited until he found his legs again. It was not the guidance of force, but the permission to fall and try again. And he did, again and again, until what was once impossible became instinct, and instinct became memory. By mid-morning, Tembo had followed his mother to the nearest watering hole, guarded on all sides by the herd. He didn't drink much. He didn't splash or play. He just stood at the edge, watching his reflection ripple in the water as if trying to understand the shape of the life he had just re-entered. Semba joined him, lowering her head beside his, their reflections blurring into one. And for a moment, the world felt still again, not in grief, but in gratitude. Because against every odd, despite every warning, in the face of every well-meaning assumption, she had stayed. And in staying, she had saved him, not with medicine, not with might, but with something quieter, something older, something that had no name, but had always been enough. It moved between them like breath, unseen but felt. A language not taught but remembered, written in the pause between movements and the stillness after storms. The kind of knowing that doesn't ask for proof or permission, only presence. That was what carried Tembo forward now. Not strength, not survival, but the echo of her refusal to leave. As the day wore on, the herd began to shift again. Grazing resumed, dust rose from their slow movements, and life in all its quiet rhythms continued. But everything had changed, not just because Tembo had survived, but because they had all witnessed something sacred. Not miraculous in the way of fairy tales, but in the way that truth sometimes stuns you into silence. A kind of resilience so gentle it doesn't roar, it hums. Tembo stayed close to his mother, never more than a trunk's reach away. He didn't play like the others, not yet, but he watched, listened, learned the patterns of dust and shade, the way her body moved like earth reshaping itself around him. And every time he stumbled, she didn't catch him. She waited, and in that waiting, taught him how to rise. Some of the rangers camped nearby for several days, monitoring from a respectful distance. They noted his breathing, his gait, his appetite. But mostly they noted her, how she never strayed, how she slept standing up with her body curved protectively around his, how she still touched him in the quiet hours of the night, even when no one was watching. Not because he needed it anymore, but because she remembered what it had taken to bring him back. By the end of the week, Tembo began to trumpet. It was faint, uncertain, like a voice unused to its own echo. But it was there, and the first time he did it, Semba didn't respond with a trumpet of her own. She simply turned her head, looked at him and blinked. Once, slow and full, as if to say, "I hear you." And that was enough. Because now he didn't just live. He belonged, not just to her, but to the earth beneath his feet, to the wind that carried the scent of distant rains, to the herd that had silently welcomed him back without ever questioning why he had stayed so long in silence. He belonged to the rhythm of the land, to the slow, patient beat of things that endure. Things like her. And Semba, who had once stood unblinking in the face of death, now walked slower. Not from fatigue, but reverence, as if each step beside her son was sacred, as if the very act of movement had become an offering. She didn't rush him. She didn't lead him. She matched his pace, stride for stride, letting him discover the world at a rhythm his body remembered and his heart could follow. The other elephants eventually resumed their roles, nursing their young, protecting the herd's flanks, navigating toward water. But something in the way they glanced at Tembo told a quieter story, one of memory, of witnessing, of a calf who should not have stood, who had done so anyway, and of a mother who had stayed, long after hope had gone silent in everyone else's eyes. There was no celebration, no grand gestures, only life continuing, shaped subtly by what they had all seen. And in that continuation, a kind of legacy was being written, not in records or reports, but in the way Semba leaned just slightly toward Tembo when the sun grew too hot, in the way he instinctively tucked himself beneath her shadow, knowing it would always be there. One morning, just before the rains came, Tembo ventured a few steps away on his own. Not far, just far enough to touch a young tree with his trunk, curious and unsure. Semba watched but didn't follow. She waited, her feet rooted in the earth, her body still. And when he turned back to look at her, just to make sure, she blinked again. And that once more was enough, because he had returned, not just from the edge of death, but into something deeper, into knowing, into trust, into home. Not as a place marked by borders or fences, but as a presence, constant, anchoring, warm. It existed in the space between two heartbeats, in the silent agreement between breath and stillness. Tembo no longer walked in the shadow of doubt or fragility. Each day his steps grew stronger, steadier, guided not by commands or instincts alone, but by the steady memory of her stillness beside him when the world had gone quiet. And Semba, though older and slower now, seemed content in that pace. Her body bore the stories of storms survived and calves carried. But with him, this one who had once not stirred, there was a softness, an unspoken attentiveness that followed him like a breeze. She no longer stood watch through the night. She didn't need to. He slept soundly now, his breath even, his body warm, curled against her side like he had always belonged there. And maybe he had. Maybe that space had been waiting for him all along. Maybe the days she spent standing vigil were not a test or a plea, but a return of time folding back to remind her that love doesn't wait to be convenient. It simply waits, without timeline, without expectation. Some said elephants forget nothing, but perhaps the real gift is not memory, but how they hold it, quietly, gently, without needing to make it into something loud. That was how Semba held those hours, the 27 that passed between breath and rebirth, not as trauma, but as a tether, a reminder of what staying can do. The rains came late that year, gentle, warm, and steady. And when the first drops touched Tembo's back, he didn't flinch. He raised his head to the sky, blinked, and let them fall. And beside him, Semba exhaled, not with effort, but peace. She had nothing left to prove, only something to share. And so they walked, not toward anything, but together. And that made all the difference. For what Tembo lacked in certainty, he found in her pace. What he feared in the unknown, he faced in her shadow. They didn't rush. They didn't stray far from the worn paths or each other. But every step they took rewrote something inside the herd, reframed what survival meant. It wasn't just breath or motion, it was being seen, chosen, kept. Simba no longer guarded him with the urgency of crisis, but with the quiet ease of understanding. She didn't count his steps anymore. She simply matched them, walked beside him as if she always had, even when he had not yet walked. And that was the truth of it. She had, in silence, in stillness, in the waiting that no one else had believed in. She had already walked every one of his steps before he ever took them. Sometimes he would fall behind, distracted by a leaf or a puddle or the strange calls of birds echoing across the open sky. And every time she would pause, never turning to look, never calling out, just standing, still, knowing. And when he returned, brushing against her leg or nuzzling her flank, she wouldn't react with fanfare, only presence, as if to say, "I knew you would." And slowly the distance between them grew, not from absence but trust. He began to explore more, play more, sleep farther away, but always within her reach. And that reach, it was never far. Because love, the kind that roots itself in stillness and survives across silence, doesn't fade when it's no longer needed to save. It just becomes quieter, truer. The rangers stopped coming after a while. There were no more vitals to check, no more breaths to count. Tembo had passed every milestone, not because anyone helped him up, but because someone refused to let go. And now, under the wide African sky, amid the gentle lull of grass and heat, two figures moved side by side. Not like a miracle, but like a memory given shape. Living proof that sometimes the fiercest kind of love is the one that waits, that watches, that stays, not behind, not above, but beside. And in that nearness, something unspoken had taken root. Not dependence, not control, but a bond born from the quiet kind of endurance, the kind that doesn't need to be loud to last, the kind that doesn't fade with time, because it was never built on time, only choice. They grazed in rhythm now, not always close, not always touching, but always aware. When Simba moved, Tembo moved. When he lingered, she lingered. Not to watch over him, but to walk with him. That distinction was everything, because what had once been survival had become something else. Something like grace, something like home carried on four growing legs and a memory of warmth that could not be broken by silence or stillness or the shadow of death. And the others noticed. The way Tembo stepped lighter now. The way he raised his trunk to mimic calls. The way he sometimes brushed his shoulder against hers for no reason at all. Just a touch, just to feel the world tethered. He would play more now and fall more too. His knees still buckled on steeper trails. His steps still wobbled when he ran. But she never rushed to correct him, never moved to fix it. She simply slowed her pace, adjusted the arc of her body, and let him find balance again on his own. And when he did, when he stood tall, even if only for a few seconds, she would stand taller too. Not because she needed to, but because now she could. Not as a mother guarding her fragile young, but as one who had endured the darkest waiting and come out whole. Not untouched, but whole. Her steps no longer echoed with tension. Her shoulders no longer carried the weight of what-ifs. There was lightness in her frame now, subtle but unmistakable. The kind of lightness that comes only when fear has finally loosened its grip, and love, once bound by desperation, is free to become joy. Tembo had become more than her calf. He was a rhythm she had remembered even in silence, a pulse that kept time inside her when everything else around her had gone still. And now that he was walking, breathing, playing, stumbling, living, she didn't need to hold him with worry anymore. She could simply be beside him, and that was enough. In the golden hush of evening, when the savannah turned to amber and the sky melted into shadows, the herd would gather close for rest. Tembo often arrived last, distracted by the world's newness, chasing birds or rocks or a breeze only he could feel. And Semba would wait. She would always wait, not because she feared for him, but because she enjoyed the quiet moment before his return, the silence just before the sigh of recognition. And every time he arrived, he would press his forehead lightly against her side, not with need, but with knowing, as if to say, "I remember." And she would lean into him, not with relief, but with peace, as if to answer, "So do I." They didn't speak, of course. Elephants never need to. They just stayed close long enough to remind each other of what had been endured, and of what had finally been left behind. The silence that once held fear now held calm. The stillness that once felt like waiting now felt like rest. There were no more glances over her shoulder, no more restless shifts in the dark. The ghosts of those 27 hours, when everyone else had walked away and she had stayed, no longer clung to her skin like dust. They had become part of her, yes, but not in a way that weighed her down. In a way that shaped her. In a way that reminded her what it meant to choose love, even when no one else could see its purpose. Tembo was no longer the calf who hadn't moved. He was the calf who had returned, who had chosen to come back to a world that hadn't waited for him. But she had. And in her waiting, she'd built a place for him that no one else could touch. A space where time didn't measure value and life wasn't defined by firsts or milestones, but by presence. Quiet, patient, unwavering presence. Some evenings he would wander just a little farther than before, testing the edges of safety, and she wouldn't follow. She'd watch. And when he came back, covered in burrs or dust or mischief, she would meet him with the same stillness she had offered the day he breathed again. Never rushing, never questioning, only witnessing, as if to say, "This too is yours." And in that stillness, in that watching, she gave him the rarest gift of all, not protection, but freedom. The freedom to fall, to explore, to forget the weight of where he began. Because the truth was, it didn't matter anymore. What mattered had already begun to bloom. And so he grew, not just in size or strength, but in stillness, in the kind of quiet that only comes from being held long enough to believe you'll never be left again. And she, Semba, no longer watched the horizon for signs of danger. She had already walked through the darkest part of her world and brought someone back from the edge. What more was there to fear when love had already proven it could outlast even death? The other elephants no longer looked at Tembo with worry. He had become part of the herd's rhythm now, folding into their migrations, their dust baths, their slow communion with the land. But every now and then, when the sun dropped low and the air turned gold, someone would pause and glance back. Not because anything was wrong, but because they remembered. They remembered the mother who wouldn't leave, the calf who wouldn't move, the waiting that changed everything. And they kept moving forward anyway. Because healing, it turns out, isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just two shapes on the horizon, walking, pausing, breathing, together, not in search of something, but as proof that it had already been found, that sometimes what survives isn't just a life, but a bond. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who believes in the power of quiet love. And if you've ever waited for healing, for hope, for someone to come back, know this: sometimes just staying is enough. Subscribe for more stories like this, because the ones who stay are the ones who change everything.